In the autumn of 1396, the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey echoed with hushed murmurs and hurried footsteps. Courtiers whispered behind gloved hands, nobles watched from beneath fur-lined hoods, and even the priest blessing the marriage could barely keep his hands from trembling. At the center of this spectacle stood King Richard II of England, 29 years old, tall, refined, and every inch the image of royal authority. Yet all eyes were drawn not to him, but to the tiny figure standing beside him, a child dressed in French silk, her dark hair braided with pearls too heavy for her small head. She was barely 7 years old. Her name was Isabella of Valois, daughter of Charles VI of France. She was about to become Queen of England. To modern eyes, this union might seem abhorrent. But in medieval Europe, political marriages were the foundation of diplomacy. Love had little to do with it. In an era still reeling from the devastation of the Black Death and the ongoing 100 Years' War, royal children were pawns, moved across borders to seal alliances, stop wars, and reinforce dynasties. And Isabella was about to become one of the most fragile, yet powerful pieces on the chessboard of European politics. The marriage was never intended to be consummated. This much was agreed upon by both courts. Isabella would be raised in England until she reached maturity. What mattered most was the message. England and France, after more than half a century of brutal conflict, were finally seeking peace. A treaty had been proposed. A massive dowry of 800,000 francs had been offered. And a 28-year truce, unthinkably long for the time, was on the table. But all of it depended on this symbolic act: the wedding of a grieving English king to a child princess from a rival kingdom. Just a year earlier, Richard had lost his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia. Her death from plague had left him devastated and without an heir. Though he resisted remarrying, his advisors warned him. Without a queen and a successor, England risked descending into chaos. When French envoys proposed the hand of young Isabella, Richard hesitated until he saw her portrait. Something shifted. He agreed. The deal was struck in Calais, then under English control. The ceremony was small, witnessed only by diplomats and nobles. Isabella wore a gown so ornate she could hardly walk. Richard bent to meet her at eye level as they exchanged rings. Courtiers noted how gently he touched her arm, how carefully he spoke to her. It wasn't affection, it was duty. In 1397, Isabella was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. Thousands gathered in London to glimpse the child monarch. Her coronation procession was a pageant of symbolism. English roses alongside French fleurs-de-lis, nobles draped in silks from both realms, and a crown forged specially for her small head. The crowd was awed, but not all were convinced. Behind the smiles and ceremonies, tensions stirred. Richard's inner circle was tight and heavily politicized. Many nobles resented the king's reliance on favorites and his conciliatory stance toward France. Peace, they believed, was weakness. Still, for young Isabella, England became home. She was given her own apartments, tutors, and a household that blended English and French traditions. She learned the customs of the court, the language of her new subjects, and how to walk the fine line between outsider and queen. But as the truce took hold and England briefly exhaled, few realized that this fragile peace, and the child who symbolized it, would soon be tested in ways no one had foreseen. Because far from Westminster, a storm was gathering, and the crown Isabella wore would not be enough to protect her from the battles to come. By 1398, Isabella had begun to shed some of her childish innocence. Now fluent in English, she navigated court life with surprising ease for someone so young. Her days were filled with lessons, languages, etiquette, history. and her nights were spent in richly furnished chambers beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Palace. Her presence had been meant to signal stability. But even as the child queen thrived in her new role, the foundation beneath her was already shifting. King Richard's grip on power had never been secure. Since his youth, he had clashed with the English nobility, a class that valued its influence as much as, if not more than, the monarch's authority. Though his marriage to Isabella bought him time, many viewed his recent peace with France not as a strategic move, but as a betrayal. England, they believed, should not sue for peace. It should demand victory. Behind closed doors, resentment festered. Powerful nobles whispered about Richard's favoritism and erratic decisions. And then, in 1399, everything changed. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin and the son of the revered John of Gaunt, returned to England from exile. Officially, he came to reclaim lands that had been confiscated. Unofficially, he brought an army. Support for Richard crumbled with shocking speed. Many lords saw in Henry not just a legitimate claimant, but a chance to restore their own influence. One by one, they defected. By the time Richard realized the extent of the rebellion, it was too late. He was captured and imprisoned. At Westminster, Isabella's world collapsed in silence. Her household was reduced overnight. Loyal ladies vanished without explanation. Armed men appeared in the corridors. The laughter and music that had once filled her chambers were replaced by whispers and warnings. She was just 9 years old. Under cover of night, she was taken to the Tower of London. Officials claimed it was for her safety, but Isabella understood enough to know what the tower truly was. A fortress, yes, but also a prison. Its thick walls had held traitors and kings alike. Now they held her. Meanwhile, Richard was forced to abdicate. He disappeared into a northern castle, and before long, reports surfaced of his death. Quietly worded, politically convenient. Whether he died of neglect or by blade, the result was the same. Isabella was no longer queen. The new king, Henry IV, visited her himself. He treated her with courtesy, but made one thing clear. Her future would be decided not by sentiment, but by strategy. Isabella had become a liability and a bargaining chip, too important to ignore, too dangerous to keep. Her status as Richard's widow tied her directly to a failed regime. And yet, her youth and lineage meant she could not simply be discarded. In the following months, her fate hung in the balance. Some argued she should be returned to France. Others insisted she remain in English custody as leverage in negotiations. Isabella, for her part, did what few could have expected. She adapted. She remained composed. She learned to wait. She was no longer just a child queen. She was a political hostage in a foreign kingdom. And the question now wasn't whether she would survive, but what her survival would cost. In early 1400, a decision was made. Henry IV, facing unrest in England and needing to reduce political tension, agreed to send Isabella back to France. But her departure came with a price. She was required to recognize Henry as the rightful king and renounce her status as Queen of England. She was 10 years old. For the new regime, it was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver. Her quiet return would dissolve any symbolic ties to Richard II's rule and signal that the chapter of their ill-fated marriage and the French alliance it represented was closed. For Isabella, it was an emotional and political defeat. Everything she had learned, adapted to, and survived was now to be erased with a signature and a journey home. She sailed across the Channel in the summer of 1401, accompanied by a heavily guarded escort. Behind her, she left the court where she had once been crowned, the gardens where she had played, and the only household she had ever truly known. The girl who arrived in France was not the same child who had left it. She returned to a royal court even more unstable than the one she had left. Her father, Charles VI, still King of France, was deep in a cycle of madness. During lucid moments, he issued commands and accepted homage. During others, he did not recognize his own family. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was strong-willed, ambitious, and quick to see opportunity. And Isabella, now shaped by English court life, was more useful than ever. As the widow of an English king, Isabella held rare diplomatic status. She had lived inside her enemy's court. She spoke the language fluently. She knew the customs, the players, and the political climate. In a kingdom that had spent decades locked in war with England, such knowledge was as powerful as any sword. But for Isabella, the return was deeply alienating. Though she had come home in name, she was treated as something between a survivor and a relic. Her French cousins viewed her with curiosity, and some even with suspicion. She had grown used to English manners, favored English clothes, and thought in two languages. She was no longer fully French, yet no longer Queen of England. At court, she was watched, not out of concern, but calculation. As 1402 wore on, France considered whether to use Isabella as justification for military action. With rebellions breaking out against Henry IV, some advisors proposed using Isabella's royal marriage as a political claim, arguing that, as Richard's widow, she might still be used to legitimize efforts to retake the English throne. But Isabella had seen what civil war looked like. She had watched a kingdom unravel from the inside. She wanted no part in fueling another. Quietly but firmly, she distanced herself from any talk of invasion or revenge. Her loyalty now belonged to no crown, but to survival. In private, she began reclaiming control of her life in subtle ways. She chose when to speak and what to reveal. She answered questions about England with deliberate vagueness, careful not to betray anyone or anything that might lead to renewed conflict. In a court that thrived on manipulation, she played the rare and dangerous role of neutrality. And in doing so, she became something rare for her time, a woman with secrets, with influence, and with power not granted by marriage or blood, but earned through experience. Yet even as she rebuilt a new life in France, fate was already drawing her into another chapter. A second marriage, one she would not be able to avoid, was being quietly negotiated behind the palace walls. And this time, the stakes would be even higher. By 1405, Isabella was no longer a pawn. At 15, she was a political survivor, fluent in power's subtle language. And now France was preparing her for a new role, not as a symbol of lost peace, but as an anchor of royal stability. The court proposed a second marriage. This time it was to Charles, Duke of Orléans, Isabella's cousin, 29 years old, one of the wealthiest and most cultured nobles in France. The match was strategic. It would keep Isabella within the royal circle, preventing foreign powers from claiming her diplomatic legacy. More importantly, it would tie her to a rising house poised to shape the future of a fractured kingdom. Unlike her first marriage, this union wasn't merely ceremonial. It was a real alliance, with shared interests, political stakes, and personal potential. Charles was no distant king grieving a dead queen. He was an active player in the volatile game of French succession, heir to the ambitions of his father, Louis of Orléans, the king's brother and de facto regent during Charles VI's frequent episodes of madness. In June 1406, Isabella and Charles married at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The ceremony was grand, its symbolism unmistakable. She wore deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, walking not as a child queen, but as a woman of status and resolve. Observers noted how she met Charles's gaze without hesitation, a quiet declaration that she was no longer anyone's possession. The early years of their marriage were filled with cautious joy. Charles's court at Blois became a sanctuary of music, literature, and political discussion. Isabella flourished there, not as a background figure, but as a partner. She commissioned manuscripts, supported poets, and advised on diplomacy. Her experiences in England, once viewed as baggage, had become assets. She knew how foreign courts functioned. She understood what alliances meant beyond words. In 1407, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter, Jeanne. For the first time in her life, Isabella experienced love not as obligation, but as something chosen and returned. She nursed the child herself, rejecting aristocratic norms, determined that Jeanne would grow up with warmth and protection, two things Isabella had seldom known. But peace, once again, would not last. That same year, Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orléans, was assassinated in Paris, hacked to death in the street by men loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. It was a political execution disguised as factional violence, but the message was clear. Power in France was no longer a debate. It was a war. With Louis gone, Charles inherited not just his title, but his enemies. And Isabella, now Duchess of Orléans, found herself at the heart of a civil war. Security around her tightened. Letters were screened, travel was restricted. Her court, once open and cultured, became wary and guarded. Charles, once a poet prince, grew harder, more militant. He prepared for battle. Isabella prepared for survival. In 1408, she gave birth to a son, Charles. A male heir in wartime was both a blessing and a burden. It meant protection, legacy, continuity. But it also meant visibility and vulnerability. Isabella's health was declining. The pregnancy had left her physically weakened, and medieval medicine offered little hope. Doctors warned that another child could kill her. Yet in the midst of this, she remained active in governance, in diplomacy, in family. Her resilience, sharpened by years of court intrigue, became legendary. Even as France fractured along dynastic lines, Isabella held fast. She shielded her children, she advised her husband. She wrote letters across Europe, urging caution where others sought revenge. Her role was no longer ceremonial. She was not just duchess, she was mediator, strategist, and conscience in a kingdom spiraling toward ruin. But the next blow would come not with sword or betrayal, but from within. And it would be the one she couldn't recover from. By 1409, Isabella of Valois was only 20 years old, yet she had already lived more lives than most queens ever would. Child bride, political hostage, widowed monarch, duchess of a divided France. Now she faced her final chapter. Her health had deteriorated since the birth of her third child, Marguerite. The pregnancy had nearly killed her. Medieval physicians offered prayers and potions, but little else. Isabella had grown pale, often bedridden, her once vigorous energy replaced by exhaustion and pain. But her mind remained sharp, and her will unshakable. France was collapsing. After the assassination of Louis of Orléans, the civil war between the Orleanists and the Burgundians had intensified. Towns were razed, nobles were slaughtered. Families turned on each other in a struggle for influence, while King Charles VI drifted in and out of madness. Into this chaos, a new threat emerged: the English. The Duke of Burgundy, seeking advantage, had begun secret talks with Henry IV of England. The possibility of English troops crossing into France again, this time at the invitation of a French faction, sent shockwaves through the court. For Isabella, it was a haunting echo of her past. She had known England, lived in its towers, been crowned beneath its vaulted cathedrals. She had watched one king fall and another rise. Now she feared that the kingdom of her birth would repeat England's collapse. She could not allow it. In private, she began writing. Through trusted intermediaries, she opened back-channel communications with the English court. Her goal was simple but bold: to dissuade Henry from entering France's civil war. She argued that intervention would be costly, futile, and destabilizing for both realms. Her words were measured, respectful, but firm. Few in France could speak to the English king with such authority. Fewer still dared to try. These were the last acts of a woman who refused to be erased by history. Despite her weakening body, Isabella continued to manage her family's affairs. She coordinated aid to towns ravaged by war, advised her husband's allies, and ensured her children's safety. Her court became a rare space of stability amid national collapse. Those who came to visit found her thoughtful, composed, even joyful at times, especially in the company of her children. But her strength was fading. By the spring of 1410, her respiratory condition, likely tuberculosis, worsened. She could no longer walk without pain. Her body, once resilient, now betrayed her daily. Still, she met with advisors, wrote letters, and held her infant daughter with trembling hands. She had lived too long in courts to ignore the political implications of her death. She made careful arrangements, instructions for the education of her children, letters for foreign rulers, plans for her burial. Even in dying, Isabella sought control. On September 13, 1410, Isabella of Valois died. She was 20. Her funeral was one of the largest in medieval France. Nobles, scholars, soldiers, and commoners walked behind her coffin. Bells rang from Paris to Blois. A girl who had once been traded like a coin between kingdoms was now mourned as a leader, a symbol, and a rare voice of conscience in a brutal age. Charles of Orléans, her husband, was devastated. Though he would remarry, those who knew him said he never truly recovered from the loss. Their children carried on her legacy. Her son became a patron of poetry and diplomacy. Her daughters married into powerful families, cementing the Orleanist line for generations. But Isabella's true legacy was less visible and more enduring. In an age where royal women were used, confined, and forgotten, she carved a space for autonomy. She made diplomacy out of survival. She found dignity where others saw only duty. And she left behind not just heirs, but a model of quiet, courageous resistance against the violence of power. Her story is not one of tragedy. It is a story of transformation, of a girl who became a queen who became a prisoner, and a prisoner who became a leader, all before the age of 20.